as I was saying, my name is Matt Zaganov. I work for an IoT startup called Samsara. Let me introduce myself just a little bit more properly to set some context. I'm based in London, the capital of Great Britain. I went to the LSE and I did my master's in applied maths over there. I did my exchange semester in the Netherlands at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And then shortly after the uni, I joined the consulting firm called BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. And I mostly worked for the London office for a little bit a shorter period of time. I worked for the Russian system of the BCG. And then as everyone based BCG in Europe, I worked in pretty much every other European country. And whilst I was a consultant, I mostly focused on two things that probably helped me get in tech. First was advanced analytics, which back in time in consulting was pretty much everything involving even a line of code. And the second thing I did quite a lot was operations improvement, which is slightly more tangential to tech, but still great. And then after BCG, I got into Facebook Audience Network. Facebook Audience Network is Facebook's ad network, as the name might suggest. And the way it works is pretty much the following. Something like, say, Angry Birds puts a piece of code from Facebook. As a matter of fact, they also do the same with Google, Unity, and other ad networks. So they put a piece of code from Facebook into their app. And then, say, Coca-Cola comes to Facebook and pays $100 million for brand advertising, just for the sake of the example. Now, most of those ads end up on Facebook-owned surfaces like the Facebook app, the Messenger app, Instagram, et cetera, but a share of them end up on the third-party apps like Angry Birds. Now, Angry Birds is an example of a publisher with a great quality, but not all of them were like that. And myself and my team were responsible for the quality of publishers on the network. Now, whilst I was at Facebook Audience Network, I got approached by Samsara, the IoT SaaS B2B startup from the Silicon Valley that happens to have a product and engineering office in London. And I was very glad to join them to start up the product and engineering team and to help grow the European office efforts. And this is where I'm currently at. Now, let me talk a little bit on this slide about the topics that I'm going to try and cover throughout this webinar. Now, I'm mostly going to try and give you a view into what things could a SaaS IoT PM do. The very high level, just to give you a flavor of what it could be. And the way I grouped everything is essentially in the slide. So the first thing that you as a SaaS IoT PM could be involved and should be involved quite a lot is the sales motion. The second thing, and that's a bit more similar to every other conventional PM, would be road mapping and supporting the developers team in terms of executing on your roadmap. And this is where the range of topics and functions that you could interact with and work with is probably the widest compared to any other PM work. Since Samsara is a hardware startup, there's quite a lot of opportunities to work with hardware. Since pretty much every piece of hardware runs firmware, you also work with firmware. Now, obviously, we have a desktop app, so you work with a cloud app, you work with a mobile app because the drivers have the mobile apps. And every good PM would be quite hands-on with the more useful analytics. So you get to work with that quite a lot. And then for some of the quirks of what we do, since we're quite active in the space that involve different legal, well, not complications, I was about to say complications, different legal quirks, you also get to work with a great and wonderful lawyers. And then the third thing after the sales motion and road mapping would be hiring. And that's not specific to the hardware B2B IoT SaaS startup. I'm going to stop saying this in a second. That's just a reality of any fast-growing startup. And you get to do this as a IoT PM quite a lot as well. Now, I'm going to try and come out with one or two interesting examples for each one of those bullet points. But before I do that, no, actually, let's just jump into it. let me first introduce Samsara, the firm I currently work for, in a bit more detail. Probably in this note, I should say that this is not an official Samsara talk. Everything I'm about to say here is my own opinions that my colleagues do not necessarily agree with, but hopefully do. Now, what is Samsara? Samsara is a startup that, in a very, very simple terms, does sensors. And as you can see in this picture that I nicked from SlideShare, those sensors go into trucks and vans. There's the main sensor, which I'm pointing to in the left-hand side of the slide. That's called a vehicle gateway. There's some secondary sensors and auxiliary equipment like temperature sensors, door monitors, cameras that plug into that initial vehicle gateway. And then there's also the app. There's also the desktop app. And essentially all we do is we put those sensors in the vehicle, we take all of the information we can take from there, and we aggregate this in a very meaningful manner. Now, this doesn't sound like a rocket science, but we're growing so fast that we surely must be doing it really well. Now, a few basic facts. At the time, now there must surely be way more than that, but at the time we had already dozens and thousands of customers. We have a bunch of offices, which is a little bit less relevant in the COVID times. A few in San Francisco, San Jose, Atlanta, and the one I'm based in, London. And a bunch of fairly well-known investors. And this is probably the main part of this slide. This is a picture from last summer when we had a big old company out in the redwoods near San Francisco. And you can see that it's a fairly large group of people. So even though we're a startup and we're, I think, still fairly small in London, less than 100 people, there's a lot of us. Now, jumping into the first topic, sales motion. By the way, our salespeople are a bit more beautiful than the guys you can see in this picture. Now, sales motion is super important for not just the IoT SaaS startup, but for, as a matter of fact, any B2B SaaS startup. And that's because you, as a good PM, would probably normally be involved in a bunch of higher profile enterprise or larger mid-market deals for a few reasons. Now, of course, most of the impact is going to be coming from the client-facing team, from the AEs, from the SEs, but you as a good PM will be able to help them in a few ways. So firstly, as a PM, you would have a fairly good knowledge of a roadmap, and specifically of the cool things that might come in the future that the account executives would not necessarily know about. And you'd be best positioned to present those things to the bigger clients and hence aid the sales motion. Now, the second thing is you as a PM would probably have the best grasp of the product. And you'd be able to do some objection handling in the most productive way, not in the sense of trying to coerce your customer into using something that they do not necessarily need, but more in a sense of creative thinking and thinking how to best use the product and to get the most of it out of it for the customer. And also, most of the bigger customers, most of the enterprise customers would have quite a lot of bespoke feature requests. Now, you as a PM would essentially be a representative of the engineering team on those talks, and you'd be best positioned to evaluate whether it would or wouldn't make sense to do a certain bespoke feature for even a big customer. You'd be in a position to try and evaluate how much time it could take it, and you eventually would be in a position to make a decision on whether a certain bespoke feature is something that you would want or wouldn't want to commit to. Now, the third really cool thing about sales motion, specifically in Europe, is multiple languages and multiple cultural backgrounds. Now, Samsara is now present in a bunch of countries, but not in all of them in Europe. But even having said this, myself and my colleagues, we get to speak with people from all the possible countries and all the possible language backgrounds, something that you would not necessarily be able to do from off the US. Even in my humble tenure, I've got to speak to my customers in obviously English, a little bit in Dutch. I didn't really speak German, but I got to speak to a lot of German customers and try to remember my borderline non-existent school level German. And then, even though we're not really selling into Russia, I've already got to speak to a bunch of Russian speaking customers. From off the top of my head, we at least got a few in Spain somehow. I don't know. That's awesome. But having said all of that, as a PM involved in the sales motion for the B2B SaaS startup, you'd be best positioned to contribute value and aid the sales team via exposing the future roadmap to some reasonable extent, committing and evaluating custom feature requests, objection handling, and just being your charming self. Now, that's just meant to illustrate that there's quite a lot of room for very tangible impact, depending on the size of the startup, in the realm of dozens or hundreds or probably even millions of dollars or pounds, euros, whatever you like the most of ACV. Now, the second topic I wanted to speak to is hardware and firmware. And this is probably the more unique and the more exciting part of the hardware IoT startups. Differently to the more conventional ones, you actually get to work with something that you could hold in your hands. It all starts off with a fairly boring and nerdy and mundane stuff. For example, in the left-hand side over here, you can see a screenshot from the FMS standard. FMS standard is essentially one of the, let's call it for simplification, cable standards that is being used in trucks. And myself and a good share of engineers at Samsara have already learned it by heart. But then the cool thing is that you get to apply and test all of that in real life. Without getting into a lot of details, let me just share that. This is one of my first customer visits from almost a year ago. You can see both myself in this orange vest and the workstation for the day in the very oily and greasy workshop. I really love those places, especially coming back to my consulting background, where you do work at such places quite a lot. And I was really psyched to have an opportunity to do this again, working for a tech firm. Now, those very much hands-on trips end up sometimes very intense, but at the same time, very satisfying and rewarding. And there's one particular customer visit that I really loved, and I just wanted to lay out the timeline of that particular day. It doesn't mean that everyone has to go through this, but there's a chance of you going through a super intense and rewarding day like this, and you might like it. Now, that particular day started off with a super early flight from London Gatwick to Basel, that tiny airport at the tri-point border of France, Germany, and Switzerland. Now, having landed there, myself, a sales engineer, and a firmware engineer, we went off to a very quaint French village where our client was based. And quite unfortunately, apart from our client, there's nothing else. So the picture you can see in the middle was genuinely our lunch spot with the food that we bought from the airport. And then after a few hours of taking that flight, we jump into breaking and fixing trucks and buses, and genuinely had a lot of fun with hardware, soldering resistors, and doing all of the irreverent things like that. Now, the coolest thing about that particular day that was, I think up to this point, already quite full with the events, was this thing. Now, that's a screenshot from my Facebook, a genuine picture that I found that reminded me of that. On the same day after those two flights, I ended up being back in London by 10 p.m. at a rock concert. And what I noticed in this picture, and I really love this, is that I'm still wearing a Samsara jersey that I put on for the client visit. And all of that happened in one day. Again, very intensive, but super rewarding. Certainly very memorable as well. Now, making it a little bit more serious, another case study or example I wanted to mention in the hardware section was one inspired by privacy. I think it is a fairly well-known fact that people do care about privacy, especially about data privacy, a bit more in Europe than they do elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of unions, there's a lot of legislation, think GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. And being driven by this and being driven by the requirements of our European customers, we have developed a thing called Privacy Button, which in a very simple terms is just a very satisfyingly clicky button with an LED that you plug into our system, and then drivers could press it in order to hide their whereabouts, for example, if they're going on their lunch break or otherwise using vehicles on their private time. And once they click it, their coordinates are hidden. We don't know where they are. Their manager doesn't know where they are. There's a bunch of checks and balances in place, but in general, this is a very much European feature driven by the European privacy request. Now, the cool thing, and the reason why I'm mentioning this, is because we're driving the development of the Privacy Button from Europe, but eventually we released it to all of our international clients, including Canada, the US, Mexico, et cetera. And it's gaining traction over there as well. And I think that's a perfect example of our London Samsara office starting off a little bit as a satellite office, but then eventually getting to the point of beginning to develop features that we also reverse export back to the US and other earlier geographies. Now, analytics. Really wanted to talk about analytics. I might have mentioned that back at BCG, I specialized on advanced analytics, and I was really psyched that there's naturally a lot of opportunities to practice different mathy-like tools at the tech firms. So what we have at Samsara, and let me point to the slide here a little bit, is a not too sophisticated tech stack of using either Databricks or BigQuery to prep the data pipelines. And then for visualization, we either use directly Databricks and Python, or feed the data into Tableau, and then we essentially use the Tableau dashboards. Now, without going into specific examples, because they feature potentially sensitive data, I'm just going to speak to the high-level nature of the analysis that you could be doing as a PM over here, and that we're doing. For example, up here, you see a scatter plot and a correlation analysis of different fuel data. And down here, you see a fairly, multi-page complex dashboard that I put together to gauge the reliability of certain European hardware that feeds off thousands of European trucks. And there you could break all the data down by models, makes, years, types of firmware, types of cables, types of OEM manufacturers of a certain equipment, and so it goes. And it's pretty cool because now it's also being used by our customer support team to some extent, and by some of the other managers as well. Now, you also get to work with legal. And the example that I wanted to talk to in this sense was the German Arbeitszeitgesetz. Now, essentially, Arbeitszeitgesetz is a working time legislation in Germany. And it tells you how many hours is a certain person allowed to work, drive, sleep, take breaks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has specific sections for the truck drivers. It has specific sections for some other professions. And the catch here is that the source document is scary. It's huge. It's 26 paragraphs long, multiple dozens of pages long, a lot of legalities, and it's in German. So it's quite hard to figure out. What we did here as a team of a product manager, a legal counsel, the German client-facing team, is that we read the whole thing, we dissected it, we prioritized it, we digested the more relevant parts for us and for our clients, and then we ended up with a very neat product and technical requirements to what exactly of this monstrous document and how exactly should be implemented. And that was a very much team effort. And this is an example of when someone like myself would get to also work with lawyers and with legal documents in a very much non-intimidating way. And then the very, very, very last thing that I wanted to speak to, which is super important in any growing startup, and we've got to do it at Samsara quite a lot as well, is hiring. As a PM, you would be involved in hiring multiple facets of people and roles, and it's super cool because it, if done right, gives you a great understanding and feeling of what types of people and what types of background are best fit for your role and for the role you're trying to fill in. And after a certain number of interviews, you get a certain spider sense to who's great and who's not necessarily so great. I really encourage everyone to read this post by an ex-colleague of mine, Rish, called "Why I Joined a Hardware Startup, and So Should You." And one of the topics that he covers there is actually hiring. And essentially, the point he makes is the same, which is you get to interview a lot of people, and you get to tune yourself to whom are you eventually looking for, and you start developing the skill of identifying great potential colleagues. Now, having said this, as a hardware PM, you get to interview engineers and mostly EMs. You get to interview the designers, and you get to interview the product managers themselves. Now, I do not necessarily think that PMs are those omnipresent Shivas. It's just the first picture that Google spat out. But I also have a funny concluding story on this, which is as part of our standard interviewing process, we usually ask candidates to do a home task. And that home task is essentially you speccing out a certain feature, writing out a product document with the requirements for that feature. And we've been using the same task for a while, and we got a pile of those solutions. At some point, we realized that in our regular weekly sales engineer PM meeting, we're discussing a feature request, a real life feature request from a customer that was essentially our home task. Now, I have to admit, I don't remember what the decision was, but I'm pretty sure that whoever was tasked with this didn't have any shortage of ideas, and I'm also sure that they used their own one because it got them into Samsara, and it must have been a good solution. Now, is that it? That's it. That's all I wanted to speak to, and thank you so much for tuning in and listening to my humble talk. Check me out on LinkedIn. My name is Matt Zaganov. Please get in touch. Happy to take any questions, comments, or concerns.